If you're a new fantasy writer, you're probably making critical conflict mistakes in your novel that are killing the tension and making your story fall flat. I know this because I've personally coached 27 fantasy writers, either by editing their novels or by helping them outline their novels, and I see the same 5 conflict mistakes come up again and again. But the good news is that once you become aware of these mistakes, they will seem so incredibly obvious to you, and it will be very easy to avoid them in your writing. I've seen many of my clients make massive improvements to their stories just by fixing these mistakes I'm about to show you. And as a fantasy author myself who's been writing novels since 2012, I've had to learn about many of these errors the hard way on my own journey towards publishing 4 books. And when you learn how to master the conflict in your story, you'll have readers writing reviews for you like this one I got for The Thunder Heist. Right from the beginning, it is high-paced and engaging from start to finish, which makes it extremely hard to put down. I can't wait to get the next book. So if you want to craft gripping conflict that will have readers absolutely tearing through your fantasy novel, the first mistake to avoid is posing pointless questions. Stories are fundamentally about 3 things: asking questions, exploring questions, and answering questions. Now, good conflict drives that exploration forward. So for example, in The Lord of the Rings, the primary question is, will Frodo be able to destroy the One Ring? And don't worry, this is a replica. I'm totally not getting corrupted by Sauron's influence. So the exploring phase of this story occurs when we show Frodo questing across Middle-earth, facing great difficulty and sacrifice along the way, and the answering portion occurs where Frodo destroys the ring with Sam and Gollum's help, resolving the central question. Now, here is the critical point I want you to understand. Good conflict asks a question that your readers desperately want the answer to. Bad conflict asks a question that no one cares about. What do I mean by that? Well, let's look at Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo, where the primary conflict is, will Alex Stern be able to solve a murder that has occurred on Yale, possibly involving the magical secret societies of the campus, or will her own inner failings and shortcomings and self-destructive tendencies prevent her from solving the murder and lead to her being expelled from Yale? So if we have a scene where Alex has to talk to a creepy ghost in order to try to find out some information about the murder, that's an example of good conflict because it's asking questions that are related to the central plot and premise of the story. Questions like, what does the ghost know? And will Alex survive the encounter? And how does one even talk with a ghost in the first place? If, on the other hand, we had a scene where Alex has an argument with her dorm mate about whose responsibility it is to clean up the dishes or something like that, that is going to feel like bad conflict because it doesn't really relate to what the story is principally about. Now, you could maybe have that second example for a couple of paragraphs just to throw in a little bit of flavor, but it certainly couldn't be something that's the focus of an entire chapter like that ghost example is in the story. Because unless you've developed genuine emotional stakes and investment in the relationship between Alex and her roommate, it's just trivial drama that doesn't really propel your story forward. And a really good way to make sure you are propelling your story forward with conflict is to avoid the next mistake: not using conflict to reveal character. Conflict is not just about action or tension for its own sake. This is something I see new writers get wrong all the time. That is something that can work well in movies where you have flashy visuals and special effects and sound and all these things that you can use to like hook people when you don't really have a connection with the character necessarily. But in a story, particularly when you're writing a fantasy novel, you don't have that luxury of action being inherently entertaining. Instead, what stories do really well is that sense of emotional connection and sort of the probing into the inner lives of a person. And that's the thing with conflict. Its true purpose is to reveal character. To quote from Robert McKee, true character is revealed in the choices a person makes under pressure. The greater the pressure, the greater the depth of true character that is revealed. And if you're wondering how to increase that pressure, then make sure you stick around because later in the video, I'm going to be revealing something I call the conflict equation. And it's a really useful tool to make sure you can ramp up the conflict when you really want to hit those high moments of tension in your story. Now, the thing is, if your conflict is not progressing the plot or developing your characters, readers are just going to wonder why the heck they even bothered reading about it in the first place. So if you can cut a particular conflict from your story and it doesn't really change the overall flow of your novel, maybe it's a good idea to cut that, or at least change it so that it does feel more important. What I want you to do is to think about every major moment of conflict in your story. Then you should be able to answer the following 3 questions. Question number 1, what new information did this reveal about your character or characters if there is a group setting here? Question number 2, what new awareness has this conflict created in your character about themselves? So what self-revelations has this conflict led to? And then number 3, how did your character grow or change as a result of this conflict? Now, if you're struggling to answer those questions, then don't worry, because there is actually a very simple fix. And to explain this simple fix, we need to move on to mistake number 3, not targeting your character's key weaknesses. The primary role of conflict should be to apply increasing pressure on your main character by forcing them to confront their flaws. For example, let's say your main character is a hopeless people pleaser who can never stand up for herself. If you throw her on a deserted island with no one else around, the conflict probably won't feel that interesting because it's not inherent or intrinsic or a natural consequence of her character's design. If, on the other hand, you put her into a story where she inherits her late mother's estate, and she's the one in charge of dividing up that estate and allocating its resources between herself and all of her family members, and she has a very tempestuous relationship with her family that makes it difficult to be around them, now you've got a conflict that feels inherent to that character, because you can better believe that in that situation, her people-pleasing tendencies are going to be attacked and exploited mercilessly by her family members and by the other people around there. She's going to be in this position where she's constantly having to juggle all these different people's desires, knowing that she can never please them all. And as a result, that conflict is attacking her unique weaknesses and flaws, and it's going to force her to have to either grow or to die. That means your conflict is going to feel much more meaningful and much more inherent and cohesive with her character arc. Now, on the other hand, if your main character was this kind of bubbly socialite who absolutely loves spending time with people, but her greatest fear is being alone, then maybe throwing that character on the deserted island all by herself is a better match for her weakness. Now, when it comes to the specifics and the tactics of how you actually target your main character's weakness with conflict, there's an exercise I like to go through with the students in my fantasy outlining bootcamp. Step 1 is to identify your main character's weakness, and then step 2 is to write down 10 different ways that you could attack and challenge that weakness. Don't be afraid to make things genuinely hard and difficult for your protagonist. I'm smiling because sometimes I see writers feel reluctant to put their characters through hell because you probably really love your character. This is why you're spending so much time writing about them. But I would say that if you truly love this character, you kind of have to be like the parent who's punishing a naughty child. You have to put them through hell because, again, it is only in those moments of extreme pressure, extreme difficulty, and extreme conflict that you really see the true nature of who someone really is at their core. But just putting your characters under pressure is not enough to write truly great conflict. To do that, you also need to make sure you are avoiding the next conflict mistake, which is repetitive conflict formats. Let's say that you have written 3 chapters in your fantasy novel. In the first chapter, your main character gets into a duel with someone else and they kill them. In the second chapter, your character also gets into a duel with someone else and they kill them. And then in the third chapter, you get the picture. They get into a duel with someone else and they kill them. It's pretty boring, right? The first duel was maybe exciting. The second duel felt a little bit repetitive. And then the third duel felt like it actually made the first 2 duels worse retroactively. So let's scrap that and try to change it to make it a bit more interesting. Let's say you still do the duel in chapter 1 because you figured out a cool and exciting way to write that. But then in the second chapter, your main character must have a hostile, difficult negotiation with this diplomat. And then in the third chapter, they have to sneak into a nobleman's quarters to steal a key piece of information for their mission. What you have there are 3 different conflict formats: fighting, diplomacy or negotiation, however you want to say it, and sneaking. And as a result, the variation in those conflicts makes the reader feel more engaged and excited to read your story. Now, you might be thinking right now, Jed, I know this is such an obvious, easy fix. I just need to vary my conflicts. And in a second, I'm actually going to give you 33 conflict categories you can use as inspiration. But the thing is that when you're caught up in the flow of writing, and I've certainly had this happen to me in the past as well, you can just kind of forget the fact that you are repeating yourself, because it might be a few weeks between scenes for you as the writer, depending on your writing pace. But for the reader, they might read all those scenes over the course of a few hours or maybe even 1 hour. So the repetition is going to affect the reader a lot more than it might affect you as a writer. And this is why outlining is probably the most useful writing skill I've developed in the 12 years that I've been at this craft. My first novel, The Aeon Academy, took me 360 days to write, and the conflicts felt highly repetitive. And that was because I never took time to outline and plan out my story initially, and so I didn't give myself this big bird's eye view of how all the different conflicts were working with each other in that book. On the other hand, when I wrote Across the Broken Stars, I outlined it ahead of time, and that gave me this nice big picture picture view to avoid these repetitive conflicts, and also a lot of the other mistakes throughout this video as well were able to be avoided simply because I had the outline to make those mistakes before I actually started writing. And when I came to write the story, it only took me 60 days to do the first draft instead of 360 days. It was much more structurally cohesive, and as a result, it needed a lot less editing before it could be published. Now, I know outlining is not for everyone, but for me personally, when you build a solid outline, it just puts you in the best position possible to be structuring your conflicts because you are just able to easily see how all these different pieces are working together with each other. Not just on a plot level, but also how your conflict relates to your characters, to your theme, and to every other aspect of your novel as well. If you want me to personally help you outline your fantasy novel, then you should apply for my Fantasy Outlining Bootcamp. This is a live training program where you'll join a small group of dedicated writers to outline and develop your story, along with tons of personal support and feedback from me along the way. I just found out that Paul, one of my students, recently finished the first draft of the book he outlined in the bootcamp a couple of months ago. Here's what he said about the program.
TLDR, it is worth every penny to take advantage of this program because you learn so much from Jed himself. Not only do you get Jed, but you have other people in the program who help you through it. You are going through the process together and learning all the tips and tools and tricks as a team, essentially. And what's funny is that what happens is you get people who will be invested in your story and they'll start asking questions and everything else. And soon you will find yourself answering questions that you learn more about your story. And you basically get more than just learning how to outline. You get a community. You get a community of people who will know your story, who will know your characters, who will know your world just by being simply exposed to it over the course of the program. So if you're really on the fence about this program, I say give it a go.
You can apply for the bootcamp by going to jedherne.com/outline or by clicking the first link in the description down below. We are closing applications for cohort 3, which is the next cohort, quite soon. So if you can't get into this cohort, you're always welcome to join the waitlist for future ones. Now, I promised to provide you a list of 33 conflict categories to inspire you in your own fantasy novel. Here is the list. You will see they are grouped into 7 types: internal, interpersonal, societal, natural, technological, supernatural, and destiny related. And there are a lot of ideas here, so you're welcome to pause the video if you want to study them in more detail. And of course, this list is far from exhaustive. Now, while changing up the types of conflicts you face in your story is really important, it's also equally important that you avoid the next mistake, which is not modulating your conflicts effectively. On a macro level, on a big picture level, your conflicts should continually escalate throughout your story. Each major plot point should raise the dramatic tensions higher and higher than the previous ones until you reach the moment of highest possible tension at your climax. Now, here's the thing I see a lot of fantasy writers get wrong. This doesn't mean that you need every single scene in your story to be more conflict-laden than the one that came previously. And in fact, that might actually be sabotaging your novel if you're trying to do it right now. See, great fantasy stories modulate their conflict. They don't try to make every scene a 10 out of 10 on the tension scale. For example, they might go from a scene with low-level 3 out of 10 conflict that then escalates up into 7 out of 10 conflict, a little bit more severe. Then there's a major twist or a major revelation, and the conflict now ramps up to a 9 out of 10. Pretty intense stuff. But your characters manage to escape, they manage to get away, they manage to resolve the conflict, and it settles back down to maybe a 1 out of 10 in intensity as they kind of take stock of things and they reflect on what just happened to them. You want to always be thinking about how your scenes work together and how they interlock and interlink with each other. 2 tense scenes in a row might actually be less exciting than one quiet scene that is then interrupted by a scene of more drama, because it's the contrast between these two things that readers will be using to guide their emotional experience in your story. Likewise, a scene where your characters are just sitting around a campfire, talking quietly, but they know that tomorrow they have to go off and fight in this big battle where most of them are probably going to die. That scene actually might not have any direct conflict, but it has a tremendous amount of suspense and tension because we know what's coming down the road. There's a useful tool you can use to check and adjust and manipulate the intensity of your conflicts. I call this the conflict equation. This is a formula that I'm still kind of developing, so I do welcome your suggestions and feedback in the comments. But here is how it goes. So for any moment of conflict in your story, the reader's engagement is going to be equal to their connection to your character. So, how much they care about your character, how much they are invested in your character's struggles, multiplied by your reader's attachment to your character, achieving the outcome, their goal that they are trying to accomplish for this particular scene, divided by the chance of success. So you can see here that as the chance of success increases, that actually decreases the amount of tension in a scene, multiplied by the cost of failure. So all other things being equal, a moment where you perceive the character's failure to be more devastating for them and to have bigger consequences for them is probably going to have more tension than one where there's less cost of failure. And then I've kind of just added this last piece in here, which is the cool factor. So, taking an ordinary kind of conflict, but then you set it in this crazy piece of your world building, which is something that you can really do in a fantasy novel quite effectively, is a cool way to boost the overall engagement that a reader has in a scene. So what's cool with this equation is that if you're writing a scene and it feels a little bit flat or not that interesting to you, look at the different variables in the equation and ask yourself, how could I pump them up? So all other things being equal, making us more connected to your character by making them more sympathetic or giving them a greater sense of uniqueness in their voice or uniqueness in the actions or the way they perceive the world is going to increase our engagement and the sense of tension in this moment of conflict. Likewise, making us want the particular outcome more is a great way to increase your tension. So, for example, if there's a romance scene or there's a sense of romantic conflict in a story, making us feel like we really need these two characters to be together, even if the characters themselves maybe don't feel the same way, that's a brilliant method for increasing the conflict and tension in your story. And you can see with this equation, you can actually apply this both at the micro level of each scene and also the macro level of your story and of your sequences as a whole. So let's run through a practical example to see this in action. Let's say I have a character who is in a prison and she's about to be executed. Now, that's a decent setup. There's a bit of conflict laden in there already, but let's see how we can actually use this conflict equation to increase our tension and sense of engagement in here further. First of all, let's look at character connection. So how about we have this character be someone who, unlike the other prisoners who are quite terrified of the impending executions, she's sort of sarcastic and witty and she's just bantering with the guards about it. She doesn't seem that fearful. And this unique sense of voice and the difference and contrast between her and the other characters in this prison, it connects us with her a little bit more. So the tension in the scene and our engagement ramps up. Then let's say that halfway through this scene, we reveal that she's actually in this prison to free another prisoner, and she allowed herself to get captured to come into the prison so that she could help the other person escape without that other person even knowing about it. So what we have here is the chance of success is actually getting decreased by this, because when it was just her having to escape, that was one thing, but now that she has to free someone else, the degree of difficulty is raised. And maybe you could also say that increases the character connection as well because it's a more unique reason to go into the prison. So to amp up the cool factor, let's set this prison on a ship that's floating on a monster-infested sea, and there's mutant guards who can fly and swim at ridiculous speeds. Again, this also decreases the chance of success. And I could go on further with this, but this is basically the opening for my pirate fantasy novel, The Thunder Heist. And if you want to see how this particular opening scene resolves, then go ahead and check out the book. Now, one thing you've probably noticed throughout the video is how important character development is relating to the conflict in your story. So if you want to learn how to write character arcs that have readers feeling insanely emotionally invested in your story, then check out this video over here. Keep writing and keep striving.